Alrighty, welcome back to another thrilling installment of Wordy Wednesdays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fraggeth, and today we're going to be reading more of Permutation City by Greg Egan. So, previously on, things got squicky and weird. Maria Deluca and Paul Durham have performed Paul's experiment to test dust theory, despite all of Maria's reservations about the matter. And they go through with it. The Paul Durham copy they have to do internal programming does not bail out. It sets to its task with aplomb and indeed zest and gusto. So it manages to perform what it was set forth to do. So, by all accounts, what they've done has succeeded. Well, the experiment was a success, but it proves nothing. So to celebrate, they get quite drunk indeed and have the worst, um, absolute worst intimate coupling ever. It does not go well for either party at all. Not like disastrously, but well, okay, pretty disastrously bad, like mortifyingly bad. Um, and so Maria has it's too late for Maria to go back home, so she stays the night. And when she wakes up in the morning, Paul Durham has eviscerated himself all over the shower and is dead. So, meat space, Paul Durham has bailed out. Um, and she's like, well, that's horrible. Why would you do this to me? And incidentally, uh, what's his name? One of the guys one of the two people who was sneaking away to the city, the digital city, um, was lied to by the other one. I don't remember their name. This is embarrassing. Let's see. Thomas Riemann goes through some masochistic psychological torture. Let's see. What's his name? No, I can't find it. It doesn't matter. We'll get to them later. Anyway, with all that dramatic horribleness happening, we now are up to part two, which is about the last quarter, say, of the book. And without further yabba dabba doo, we will get rolling. Well, how about that? Part two, permutation. Oh, whoa, one sec. Part two, permutation city. Chapter 23. Maria woke from dreamless sleep, clear-headed, tranquil. She opened her eyes and looked around. The bed, the room, were unfamiliar. Both were large and luxurious. Everything appeared unnaturally pristine, unsullied by human habitation, like an expensive hotel room. She was puzzled but unperturbed. An explanation seemed to be on the verge of surfacing. She was wearing a nightdress she'd never seen before in her life. She suddenly remembered the Landau clinic. Chatting with the technicians, borrowing the marker pen, the tour of the recovery rooms, the anesthetist asking her to count. She pulled her hands out from beneath the sheet. Her left palm was blank. The comforting message she'd written there was gone. She felt the blood drain from her face. Before she had a chance to think, Durham stepped into the room. For a moment she was too shocked to make a sound. Then she screamed at him, "What have you done to me? I'm the copy, aren't I? You're running the copy!" Trapped in the launch software, with 2 minutes to live? Durham said quietly, "Yes, you're the copy." "How? How did you do it? How could I let it happen?" She stared at him, desperate for a reply, enraged more than anything else by the thought that they might both vanish before she'd heard the explanation. Before she understood how he'd broken through all of her elaborate safeguards. But Durham just stood by the doorway looking bemused and embarrassed, as if he'd anticipated a reaction like this, but couldn't quite credit it now that it was happening. Finally she said, "This is the launch, isn't it? This isn't the launch, is it? This is later. You're another version. You stole me. You're running me later." "I didn't steal you." He hesitated, then added cautiously, "I think you know exactly where you are, and I agonized about waking you, but I had to do it. There's too much going on here that you'll want to see, want to be a part of. I couldn't let you sleep through it all. That would have been unforgivable." Maria disregarded everything he'd said. "You kept my scan file after the launch. You duplicated it somehow." "No, the only place your scan file data ever went was the Garden of Eden configuration, as agreed. And now you're in Permutation City, in the TVC universe, now commonly known as Elysium, running on nothing but its own laws." Maria sat up in bed slowly, bringing her knees up to her chest, trying to accept the situation without panicking, without falling apart. Durham was insane, unpredictable, dangerous. When was she going to get that into her skull? In the flesh, she could probably have broken his fucking neck if she had to defend herself, but if he controlled this environment, she was powerless. He could rape her, torture her, do anything at all. The very idea of him attacking her still seemed ludicrous, but she couldn't rely on the way he'd treated her in the past to count for anything. He was a liar and a kidnapper. She didn't know him at all. Right now, though, he was being as civilized as ever. He seemed intent on keeping up the charade. She was afraid to test this veneer of hospitality, but she forced herself to say evenly, "I want to use a terminal." Durham gestured at the space above the bed, and a terminal appeared. Maria's heart sank. She realized that she'd been hanging on to the slender hope that she might have been human. And that was still possible. Durham himself had once been memory wiped and fooled into thinking he was a copy, when he was merely a visitor. Or at least he'd claimed that it had happened, in another world. She tried half a dozen numbers, starting with Francesca's, ending with Aidan's. The terminal declared them all invalid. She couldn't bring herself to try her own. Durham watched in silence. He seemed to be caught between genuine sympathy and a kind of clinical fascination, as if an attempt to make a few phone calls cast doubt on her sanity, as if she was engaged in some bizarre psychotic behavior worthy of the closest scrutiny, peering behind a mirror in search of the objects seen in the reflection, talking back to a television program, or making calls on a toy phone. Maria pushed the floating machine away angrily. It moved easily, but came to a halt as soon as she took her hands off it. Patchwork VR and its physics of convenience seemed like the final insult. She said, "Do you think I'm stupid? What does a dummy terminal prove?" "Nothing. So why don't you apply your own criteria?" he said. "Central computer." And the terminal flashed up an icon-studded menu, headed Permutation City Computing Facility. Not many people use this interface these days. It's the original version, designed before the launch, but it still plugs you into as much computing power as the latest co-personality links. He showed Maria a text file. She recognized it immediately. It was a program she'd written herself to solve a large, intentionally difficult set of Diophantine equations. Diophantine. The Diophantine equations. The output of this program was the key they'd agreed upon to unlock Durham's access to the other copies after the launch. He ran it. It spat out its results immediately. A screen full of numbers, the smallest of which was 20 digits long. On any real-world computer, it should have taken years. Maria was unimpressed. You could have frozen us while the program was running, making it seem like no time had passed. Or you could have generated the answers in advance. She gestured at the terminal. I expect you're faking all of this. You're not talking to a genuine operating system. You're not really running the program at all. Feel free to alter some parameters in the equations and try again. She did. The modified program ran just as quickly, churning out a new set of answers. She laughed sourly. So what am I supposed to do now? Verify all this? Verify all this in my head? You could put any bullshit you liked on the screen. I wouldn't know the difference. And if I wrote another program to check the results, you could fake its operation too. You control this whole environment, don't you? So I can't trust anything. Whatever I do to try to test your claims, you can intervene and make it go your way. Is that why you wanted my scan file all along? So you could lock me in here and bombard me with lies? Finally prove all your mad ideas to someone? You're being paranoid now. Am I? You're the expert. She looked around the luxurious prison cell. Red velvet curtains stirred in a faint breeze. She slipped out of bed and crossed the room, ignoring Durham. The more she argued with him, the harder it was to be physically afraid of him. He'd chosen his form of torture, and he was sticking to it. The window looked out on a forest of glistening towers, no doubt correctly rendered according to all the laws of optics, but still too slick to be real, like some 1920s expressionist film set. She'd seen the sketches. This was Permutation City, whatever hardware it was running on. She looked down. They were 70 or 80 stories up. The street was all but invisible, but just below the windows, a dozen meters to the right, a walkway stretched across to an adjacent building, and she could see the puppet citizens, chatting together in twos and threes as they strode toward their imaginary destinations. All of this looked expensive, but Slowdown could buy a lot of subjective computing power, if that was the trade-off you wanted to make. How much time had passed in the outside world? Years? Decades? Had she managed to save Francesca? Durham said, You think I've kidnapped your scan file and run this whole city solely for the pleasure of deceiving you? It's the simplest explanation. It's ludicrous, and you know it. I'm sorry. I know this must be painful for you, but I didn't do it lightly. It's been 7,000 years. I've had a lot of time to think it over. She spun around to face him. Stop lying to me! He threw his hands up in a gesture of contrition and impatience. Maria, you are in the TVC universe. The launch worked. The dust hypothesis has been vindicated. It's a fact, and you'd better come to terms with that because you're now part of a society which has been living with it for millennia. And I know I said I'd only wake you if Planet Lambert failed, if we needed you to work on the biosphere seed. All right, I've broken my word on that. But it was the wrong promise to make. Planet Lambert hasn't failed. It succeeded beyond your wildest dreams. How could I let you sleep through that? An interface window appeared in midair beside her, showing a half-lit blue and white world. I don't expect the continents will look familiar. We've given the Autoverse a lot of resources. 7,000 years, for most of us, has been about 3 billion for Planet Lambert. Maria said flatly, "You're wasting your time. Nothing you show me is going to change my mind." But she watched the planet, transfixed, as Durham moved the viewpoint closer. She broke through the clouds near the east coast of a large mountainous island. They broke through the clouds near the east coast of a large mountainous island, part of an archipelago straddling the equator. The bare surface rock of the peaks was the color of ochre, no mineral she'd included in the original design, but time and geochemistry could have thrown up something new. The vegetation, which covered almost every other scrap of land, right to the waterline, came in shades of blue-green. As the viewpoint descended, and the textures resolved themselves, Maria saw only grasses and shrubs, nothing remotely like a terrestrial tree. Durham zeroed in on a meadow not far from the coast, a few hundred meters back, according to the scale across the bottom of the image, and about what she would have guessed from cues in the landscape, unexpectedly validated. What looked at first like a cloud of wind-borne debris, seeds of some kind, blowing above the grass, resolved into a swarm of shiny black insects. Durham froze the image, then zoomed in on one of the creatures. It was no insect by the terrestrial definition. There were 4 legs, not 6, and the body was clearly divided into 5 segments: the head, sections bearing the forelegs, wings, and hind legs, and the tail. Durham made hand movements and rotated the view. The head was blunt, not quite flat, with 2 large eyes, if they were eyes, shiny bluish discs with no apparent structure. The rest of the head was coated in fine hairs, lined up in a complex, symmetrical pattern which reminded Maria of Maori facial tattoos. Sensors for vibration or scent? She said, "Very pretty, but you forgot the mouth. They put food into a cavity directly under the wings." He rotated the body to show her. "It adheres to those bristles and gets dissolved by the enzymes they secrete. You'd think it would fall out, but it doesn't. Not until they've finished digesting it and absorbing nutrients, and then a protein on the bristles changes shape, switching off the adhesion. Their whole stomach is nothing but this sticky droplet hanging there, open to the air. You might have come up with something more plausible." Durham laughed. "Exactly!" The single pair of wings were translucent brown, looking like they were made of a thin layer of the same stuff as the exoskeleton. The 4 legs each had a single joint, and terminated in feathery structures. The tail segment had brown and black markings like a bullseye, but there was nothing at the center. A dark tube emerged from the bottom of the rim, narrowing into a needle-sharp point. "The Lambertians have diploid chromosomes, but only one gender. Any 2 of them can inject DNA, one after the other, into certain kinds of plant cell. Their genes take over the cell and turn it into a cross between a cyst and an egg. They usually choose a particular spot on the stems of certain species of shrub. I don't know if you'd call it parasitism, or just nest building on a molecular level. The plant nourishes the embryo and survives the whole process in perfect health. And when the young hatch, they return the favor by scattering seeds. Their ancestors stole some of the control mechanisms from a plant virus a billion years ago. There are a lot of genetic exchanges like that. The kingdoms are a lot more biochemically similar here than they were on Earth." Maria turned away from the screen. The stupidest thing was, she kept wanting to ask questions, press him for details. She said, "What's next? You zoom right in and show me the fine anatomical structure, the insect cells, the proteins, the atoms, the autoverse cells? And that's supposed to convince me that the whole planet is embedded in the autoverse? You unfreeze this thing, let it fly around, and I'm meant to conclude that no real-world computer could ever run an organism so complex, modeled at such a deep level? As if I could personally verify that after every flap of its wing Oh, sorry. As if I could personally verify that every flap of its wings corresponded to a valid sequence of a few trillion cellular automaton states. It's no different than the equation results. It wouldn't prove a thing." Durham nodded slowly. All right. What if I showed you some of the other species? Or the evolutionary history? The paleogenetic record? We have every mutation on file since the year zero. You want to sit down with that and see if it looks authentic? No, I want a terminal that works. I want you to let me call my original. I want to talk to her. And between us, maybe we can decide what I'm going to do when I get out of this fucking madhouse and into my own JSN account. Durham looked rattled, and for a moment she believed she might finally be getting through to him. But he said, I woke you for a reason. We're going to be making contact with the Lambertians soon. It might have been sooner, but there have been complications, political delays. He'd lost her completely now. Contact with the Lambertians? What's that supposed to mean? He gestured at the motionless insect, backside and genitals still facing them. This is not some species I picked at random. This is the pinnacle of autoverse life. They're conscious, self-aware, highly intelligent. They have almost no technology, but their nervous system is about 10 times more complex than a human's, and they can go far beyond that for some tasks, performing a kind of parallel computing in swarms. They have chemistry, physics, astronomy. They know there are 32 atoms, although they haven't figured out the underlying cellular automaton rules yet. And they're modeling the primordial cloud. These are sentient creatures, and they want to know where they came from. Maria turned her hand in front of the screen, bringing the Lambertian's head back into view. She was beginning to suspect that Durham actually believed every word he was saying, in which case maybe he hadn't, personally, contrived these aliens. Maybe some other version of him, the flesh and blood original, was deceiving both of them. If that was the case, she was arguing with the wrong person. But what was she supposed to do instead? Start shouting pleas for freedom to the sky? She said numbly, 10 times more complex than a human brain? Their neurons use conducting polymers to carry the signal instead of membrane action potentials. The cells themselves are comparable in size to a human's, but each axon and dendrite carries multiple signals. Durham moved the viewpoint behind the Lambertian's eye and showed her. A neuron in the optic nerve, under close examination, contained thousands of molecules like elaborately knotted ropes, running the whole length of the cell body. At the far end, each polymer was joined to a kind of vesicle, the narrow molecular cable dwarfed by the tiny pouch of cell membrane pinched off from the outside world. There are almost 3,000 distinct neurotransmitters. They're all proteins built from 3 subunits with 14 possibilities for each subunit. A bit like human antibodies, the same trick for generating a wide spectrum of shapes. And they bind to their receptors just as selectively as an antibody to an antigen. Every synapse is a 3,000 channel biochemical switchboard with no crosstalk. That's the molecular basis of Lambertian thought. He added wryly, which is more than you and I possess, a molecular basis for anything. We still run the old patchwork models of the human body, expanded and modified according to taste, but still based on the same principles as John Vine's first talking copy. There's a long-term project to give people the choice of being implemented on an atomic level, but quite apart from the political complications, even the enthusiasts keep finding more pressing things to do. Durham moved the viewpoint out through the cell wall and turned it back to face the terminal end of the neuron. He changed the color scheme from atomic to molecular to highlight the individual neurotransmitters with their own distinctive hues. Then he unfroze the image. Several of the gray lipid membrane vesicles switched open, disgorging floods of brightly colored specks. Tumbling past the viewpoint, they resolved into elaborate, irregular globules with a bewildering variety of forms. Durham swung the angle of view forward again, and headed for the far side of the synapse. Eventually, Maria could make out color-coded receptors embedded in the receiving neuron's cell wall, long chain molecules folded together into tight zigzagged rings with lumpy depressions on the exposed surface. For several minutes they watched thousands of mismatched neurotransmitters bounce off one receptor until Durham became bored and pleaded with the software. "Show us a fit." The image blurred for a second and then returned to the original speed as a correctly shaped molecule finally stumbled onto its target. It hit the receptor and locked into place. Durham plunged the viewpoint through the cell membrane in time to show the immersed tail section of the receptor changing its configuration in response. He said, "That will now catalyze the activation of a second messenger, which will feed energy into the appropriate polymer, unless there's an inhibiting messenger already bound there, blocking access." He spoke to the software again. It took control of the viewpoint and showed them each of the events he'd described. Maria shook her head, bedazzled. "Tell me the truth. Who orchestrated this? 3,000 neurotransmitters, 3,000 receptors, 3,000 second messengers? No doubt you can show me the individual structures of all of them, and no doubt they really would behave the way that you claim they do. Even writing the software to fake this would have been an enormous job. Who did you commission? There can't be many people who'd take it on." Durham said gently, "I commissioned you. You can't have forgotten. A seed for a biosphere? A demonstration that life in the Autoverse could be as diverse and elaborate as life on Earth? No, from high hydrophila to this would take billions of years of Autoverse time, computing powers computing power orders of magnitude beyond the resources of 21st century Earth. That's what planet Lambert needed, and that's exactly what it's been given." Maria backed away from the screen until she could go no further, then slid down the wall beside the red-draped window and sat on the plushly carpeted floor. She put her face in her hands and tried to breathe slowly. She felt like she'd been buried alive. Did she believe him? It hardly seemed to matter anymore. Whatever she did, he was going to keep on bombarding her with evidence like this, consistent with his claims. Whether he was deliberately lying or not, and whether he was being fooled by another version of himself, or whether the dust hypothesis was right after all, he was never going to let her out of here, back into the real world. Psychotic liar, fellow victim, or calm purveyor of the truth, he was incapable of setting her free. Her original was still out there, with the money to save Francesca. That was the point of the whole insane gamble, the payoff for risking her soul. If she could remember that, cling to that, maybe she could keep herself sane. Durham pressed on, oblivious to her distress, or intent on delivering the coup de grace. He said, "Who could have engineered this? You know how long it took Max Lambert to translate a real-world bacterium. Do you honestly believe that I found someone who could manufacture a functioning, novel, pseudo-insect out of thin air, let alone an intelligent one?" All right, you can't personally check macroscopic behavior against the Autoverse rules, but you can study all the biochemical pathways, trace them back to the ancestral species. You can watch an embryo grow cell by cell, following the gradients of control hormones, the differentiating tissue layers, the formation of organs. The whole planet is an open book to us. You can examine whatever you like, scrutinize it on any scale, from viruses to ecosystems, from the activation of a molecule of retinal pigment to the geochemical cycles. There are 690 million species currently living on planet Lambert, all obeying the laws of the Autoverse, all demonstrably descended from a single organism which lived 3 billion years ago, and whose characteristics I expect you know by heart. Do you honestly believe that anyone could have designed all that?" Maria looked up at him angrily. "No, of course it evolved. It must have evolved. You can shut up now. You've won. I believe you. But why did you have to wake me? I'm going to lose my mind." Durham squatted down and put a hand on her shoulder. She started sobbing dryly as she attempted to as she attempted to dissect her loss into parts she could begin to comprehend. Francesca was gone. Aidan was gone. All her friends, all the people she'd ever met, in the flesh, on the networks, all the people she'd ever heard of, musicians and writers, philosophers and movie stars, politicians and serial killers. They weren't even dead. Their lives didn't lie in her past, whole and comprehensible. They were scattered around her like dust, meaningless, disconnected. Everything she'd ever known had been ground down into random noise. Durham hesitated, then put his arms around her clumsily. She wanted to hurt him, but instead she clung to him and wept, teeth clenched, fists tight, shuddering with rage and grief. He said, "You're not going to lose your mind. You can live any life you want to here. 7,000 years means nothing. We haven't lost the old culture. We still have all the libraries, the archives, the databases. There are thousands of people who'll want to meet you, people who respect you for what you've done. You're a myth. You're a hero of Elysium. You're the sleeping 18th founder. We'll hold a festival in honor of your awakening." Maria pushed him away. "I don't want that. I don't want any of that." "All right, it's up to you." She closed her eyes and huddled against the wall. She knew she must have looked like a petulant child, but she didn't care. She said fiercely, "You've had the last word, the last laugh. You've brought me to life just to rub my nose in the proof of your precious beliefs. And now I want to go back to sleep. Forever. I want all of this to vanish." Durham was silent for a while. Then he said, "You can do that if you really want to. Once I've shown you what you've inherited, once I've shown you how to control it, you'll have the power to seal yourself off from the rest of Elysium. If you choose sleep, then nobody will ever be able to wake you. But don't you want to be there, on planet Lambert, when we make first contact with the civilization that owes its existence to you?" Chapter 24. Rut City. Pier was in his workshop, making a table leg on his lathe, when Kate's latest message caught his eye. "You have to see this, please. Meet me in the city." He looked away. He was working with his favorite timber, sugar pine. He'd constructed his own plantation from a gene library and plant cell maps, modeling individual examples of each cell type down to an atomic level, then encapsulating their essential behavior in rules which he could afford to run billions of times over, for tens of thousands of trees. In theory, he could have built the whole plantation from individual atoms, and that would have been the most elegant way to do it by far, but slowing himself down to a time frame in which the trees grew fast enough to meet his needs would have meant leaving Kate far behind. He stopped the lathe and reread the message, which was written on a poster tacked to the workshop's notice board, the only part of his environment he allowed her to access while he was working. The poster looked quite ordinary, except for an eye-catching tendency for the letters to jump up and down when they crossed his peripheral vision. He muttered, "I'm happy here. I don't care what they're doing in the city." The workshop abutted a warehouse full of table legs, 162,329 so far. Pierre could imagine nothing more satisfying than reaching the 200,000 mark, although he knew it was likely that he'd change his mind and abandon the workshop before that happened. New vocations were imposed by his exoself at random intervals, but statistically the next one was overdue. Immediately before taking up woodwork, he'd passionately devoured all the higher mathematics texts in the central library, ran all the tutorial software, and then personally contributed several important new results to group theory, untroubled by the fact that none of the Elysian mathematicians would ever be aware of his work. Before that, he'd written over 300 comic operas, with librettos in Italian, French, and English, and staged most of them with puppet performers and audience. Before that, he'd patiently studied the structure and biochemistry of the human brain for 67 years. Toward the end, he had fully grasped, to his own satisfaction, the nature of the process of consciousness. Every one of these pursuits had been utterly engrossing and satisfying at the time. He'd even been interested in the Elysians once. No longer. He preferred to think about table legs. He was still interested in Kate, though. He'd chosen that as one of his few invariants. And he'd been neglecting her lately. They hadn't met in almost a decade. He looked around the workshop wistfully, his gaze falling on the pile of fresh timber in the corner, but then he strengthened his resolve. The pleasures of the lathe beckoned, but love meant making sacrifices. Pier took off his dust coat, stretched out his arms, and fell backward into the sky above the city. Kate met him while he was still airborne, swooping down from nowhere and grabbing his hand, nearly wrenching his arm from its socket. She yelled above the wind, "So you're still alive after all. I was beginning to think you'd shut yourself down, gone looking for the next life without me." Her tone was sarcastic, but there was an edge of genuine relief. 10 years could still be a long time, if you let it. Pier said gently but audibly, "You know how busy I am, and when I'm working—" She laughed derisively. "Working? Is that what you call it? Taking pleasure from something that would bore the stupidest factory robot to death?" Her hair was long and jet black, whipping up around her face as if caught by the wind at random, but always concealing just enough to mask her expression. "You're still—" The wind drowned out his words. Kate had disabled his aphysical intelligibility. He shouted, "You're still a sculptor, aren't you? You ought to understand. The wood, the grain, the texture." "I understand that you need prosthetic interests to help pass the time, but you could try setting the parameters more carefully." "Why should I?" Being forced to raise his voice made him feel argumentative. He willed his exoself to circumvent the effect, and screamed calmly, "Every few decades, at random, I take on new goals. At random. It's perfect. How could I improve on a scheme like that? I'm not stuck on any one thing forever. However much you think I'm wasting my time, it's only for 50 or 100 years. What difference does that make in the long run?" "You could still be more selective." "What did you have in mind? Something socially useful? Famine relief work? Counseling the dying? Or something intellectually challenging? Uncovering the fundamental laws of the universe? I have to admit that the TVC rules have slipped my mind completely. It might take me all of 5 seconds to look 'em up again. Searching for God? That's a difficult one. Paul Durham never returns my calls. Self-discovery? You don't have to leave yourself open to every conceivable absurdity." "If I limit the range of options, I'd be repeating myself in no time at all. And if you find the phase I'm passing through so unbearable, you can always make it vanish. You can freeze yourself until I change." Kate was indignant. "I have other time frames to worry about besides yours." "The Elysians aren't going anywhere." He didn't add that he knew she'd frozen herself half a dozen times already, each time for a few more years than the time before. She turned toward him, parting her hair to show one baleful eye. "You're fooling yourself, you know. You're going to repeat yourself eventually. However desperately you reprogram yourself, in the end you're going to come full circle and find that you've done it all before." Pier laughed indulgently and shouted, "We've certainly been through all this before, and you know that's not true. It's always possible to synthesize something new, a novel art form, a new field of study, a new aesthetic, a new obsession." Falling through the cool, late afternoon air beside her was exhilarating, but he was already missing the smell of wood dust. Kate rendered the air around them motionless and silent, although they continued to descend. She released his hand and said, "I know we've been through this before. I remember what you said last time. If the worst comes to the worst, for the first 100 years you can contemplate the number 1. For the second 100 years you can contemplate the number 2, and so on ad infinitum. Whenever the numbers grow too big to hold in your mind, you can always expand your mind to fit them. QED. You'll never run out of new and exciting interests." Pierre said gently, "Where's your sense of humor? It's a simple proof that the worst case scenario is still infinite. I never suggested actually doing that." "But you might as well." Now that her face was no longer concealed, she looked more forlorn than angry. By choice, if not necessarily by artifice. "Why do you have to find everything so fulfilling? Why can't you discriminate? Why can't you let yourself grow bored with things? Then move on. Pick them up again later if you feel the urge." Sounds awfully quaint to me. Very human.
It did work for them, sometimes.
Yes, and I'm sure it works for you, sometimes. You drift back and forth between your art and watching the great Elysian soap opera, with a decade or two of aimless depression in between. You're dissatisfied most of the time, and letting that happen is a conscious choice, as deliberate and arbitrary as anything I impose on myself. If that's how you want to live, I'm not going to try and change you, but you can't expect me to live the same way. She didn't reply. After a moment, the bubble of still air around them blew away, and the roar of the wind drowned the silence again. Sometimes he wondered if Kate had ever really come to terms with the shock of discovering that stowing away had granted them not a few 100 years in a billionaire's sanctuary, but a descent into the abyss of immortality. The copy who had persuaded David Hawthorne to turn his back on the physical world, the committed follower, even before her death, of the solipsist nation philosophy, the woman who had needed no brain rewiring or elaborate external contrivances to accept her software incarnation, now acted more and more like a flesh and blood wannabe, or rather Elysian wannabe, year by year. And there was no need for it. Their tiny slice of infinity was as infinite as the whole. Ultimately, there was nothing the Elysians could do that Kate couldn't. Except walk among them as an equal, and that was what she seemed to covet the most. True, the Elysians had deliberately set out to achieve the logical endpoint of everything she'd ever believed copies would be that copies should be striving for, while she'd merely hitched a ride by mistake. Their world would always, Elysian instant compared to Elysian instant, be bigger and faster than her own. So, naturally, according to archaic human values which she hadn't had the sense to erase, she wanted to be part of the main game. But Pierre still found it absurd that she spent her life envying them when she could have generated, or even launched, her own, equally complex, equally populous society, and turned her back on the Elysians as thoroughly as they'd turned their back on Earth. It was her choice. Pierre took it in his stride, along with all their other disagreements. If they were going to spend eternity together, he believed they'd resolve their problems eventually, if they could be resolved at all. It was early days yet, as it always would be. He rolled over and looked down at the city, or the strange recursive map of the city which they made do with, buried as they were in the walls and foundations of the real thing. Malcolm Carter's secret parasitic software wasn't blind to its host. They could spy on what was going on in the higher levels of the program which surreptitiously ran them, even though they couldn't affect anything which happened here. They could snatch brief, partial recordings of activity in the real city and play them back in a limited duplicate environment. It was a bit like being the widely separated letters in the text of Ulysses, which read, "Pierre and Kate read Leopold Bloom wandered through Dublin," if not quite so crude an abridgment. Certainly, the view from the air was still breathtaking. Pierre had to concede that it was probably indistinguishable from the real thing.
The sun was setting over the ocean as they descended, and the Ulam Falls glistened in the east like a sheet of amber set in the granite face of Mount Vine. In the foothills, a dozen silver needles and obsidian prisms, fanciful watchtowers, caught the light and scattered it between them. Pier followed the river down, through lush tropical forests, across dark plains of grassland, into the city itself. The buildings on the outskirts were low and sprawling, becoming gradually taller and narrower, the profiles swept up in a curve which echoed the shape of Mount Vine. Closer to the center, 1,000 crystalline walkways linked the city's towers at every level, connections so dense and stellated as to make it seem possible that every building was joined, directly, to all the rest. That wasn't true, but the sense that it might have been was still compelling. Decorative crowds filled the streets and walkways, mindless puppets obeying the simplest rules, but looking as purposeful and busy as any human throng. A strange adornment, perhaps, but not much stranger than having buildings and streets at all. Most Elysians merely visited this place, but last time Pier had concerned himself with such things, a few hundred of them, mainly third generation, had taken up inhabiting the city full time, adopting every detail of its architecture and geography as fixed parameters, swearing fidelity to its Euclidean distances. Others, mainly first generation, had been appalled by the behavior of this sect. It was strange how reversion was the greatest taboo among the oldest Elysians, who were so conservative in most other ways. Maybe they were afraid of becoming homesick. Kate said, "Town Hall." He followed her down through the darkening air. The city always smelled sweet to Pier, sweet but artificial, like a newly unwrapped electronic toy, all microchips and plastic, from David Hawthorne's childhood. They spiraled around the central golden tower, the city's tallest, weaving their way between the transparent walkways, playing Peter Pan and Tinker Bell. Pier had long ago given up arguing with Kate about the elaborate routes she chose for entering the reconstruction. She ran this peephole on the city out of her own time, and she controlled access to the environment completely. He could either put up with her rules or stay away altogether. And the whole point of being here was to please her. They alighted on the paved square outside the town hall's main entrance. Pier was startled to recognize one of the fountains as a scaled up version of Malcolm Carter's demonstration for his algorithmic piggyback tricks, a cherub wrestling a snake. He must have noticed it before, he'd stood on this spot 100 times, but if so, he'd forgotten. His memory was due for maintenance. It was a while since he'd increased the size of the relevant networks, and they were probably close to saturation. Simply adding new neurons slowed down recall, relative to other brain functions, making some modes of thought seem like swimming through molasses. A whole host of further adjustments were necessary to make the timing feel right. The Elysians had written software to automate this tuning process, but he disliked the results of the versions they'd shared with each other, and hence made accessible to him, so he'd written his own, but he'd yet to perfect it. Things like table legs kept getting in the way. The square wasn't empty, but the people around them all looked like puppets merely strolling past. The city's owners were already inside, and so Kate's software, which spied on the true city and reconstructed it for the two of them, was carrying most of the burden of computing the appearance of their surroundings, now officially unobserved. He took Kate's hand, and she allowed it, although she made her skin feel as cold as marble, and they walked into the hall. The cavernous room was about half full, so some 8,000 Elysians had turned up for the meeting. Pier granted himself a brief bird's eye view of the crowd. A variety of fashions in clothing, or lack of it, and body type were represented, certainly spanning the generations, but most people had chosen to present in more or less traditional human form. The exceptions stood out. One clique of fourth generation Elysians displayed themselves as modified Babbage engines. The entire hall couldn't have held one of them to scale, so portions of the mechanism poked through into their seating allocation from some hidden dimension. Ditto for those who turned up as Cyril's Chinese rooms, huge troops of individual humans, or human-shaped automatons, each carrying out a few simple tasks, which together amounted to a complete working computer. The components seated in the hall were Kali-armed blurs, gesticulating at invisible colleagues with coded hand movements so rapid that they seemed to merge into a static multiple exposure. Peer had no idea how either type of system collected sound and vision from its surroundings to feed to the perfectly normal illusions these unwieldy computers were, presumably, simulating, as the end result of all their spinning cogs and frantic hand movements, or whether the people in question experienced anything much different than they would have if they'd simply shown that standard physiological model to the world. Pretentious fancy dress aside, there were a smattering of animal bodies visible, which may or may not have reflected their inhabitants' true models. It could be remarkably comfortable being a lion, or even a snake, if your brain had been suitably adapted for the change. Peer had some time Peer had spent some time inhabiting the bodies of animals, both historical and mythical, and he'd enjoyed them all. But when the phase was over, he'd found that with very little rewiring, he could make the human form feel every bit as good. It seemed more elegant to be comfortable with his ancestral physiology. The majority of Elysians apparently agreed. 8,000 was a typical attendance figure, but Peer could not have said what fraction of the total population it represented. Even leaving out Callus, Sean, and Riemann, the three founders who'd remained in their own private worlds, never making contact with anyone, there might have been hundreds or thousands of members of the later generations who'd opted out of the core community without ever announcing their existence. The ever-expanding cube of Elysium had been divided up from the outset into 24 ever-expanding oblique pyramids, one for each of the 18 founders and their offspring, and 6 for common ventures, such as Permutation City itself, but mostly Planet Lambert. Oh, there's a big hyphen in the middle there that I somehow missed with my brain. Such as Permutation City itself, but mostly Planet Lambert. Most Elysians, or at least most who used the city, had chosen to sync themselves to a common time rate. This standard time grew steadily faster against absolute time, the ticking of the TVC cellular automaton's clock, so every Elysian needed a constantly growing allocation of processors to keep up. But Elysium itself was growing even faster, leaving everyone with an ever larger surplus of computing power. Each founder's territory was autonomous, subdivided on his or her own terms. By now, each one could have supported a population of several trillion living by standard time. But Peer suspected that most of the processors were left idle, and he had occasionally daydreamed about some fifth-generation Elysian studying the city's history, getting a curious hunch about Malcolm Carter, and browbeating one of the founders into supplying the spare computing resources of a near-empty pyramid to scan the city for stowaways. All of Carter's ingenious camouflage, and the atom-in-a-haystack odds which had been their real guarantee against discovery, would count for nothing under such scrutiny, and once their presence was identified, they could easily be disinterred, assuming that the Elysians were generous enough to do that for a couple of petty thieves. Kate claimed to believe that this was inevitable in the long term. Peer didn't much care if they were found or not. All that really mattered to him was the fact that the city's computational infrastructure was also constantly expanding, to enable it to keep up with both the growing population and the ever-increasing demands of Elysian Standard Time. As long as that continued, his own tiny fraction of those resources also steadily increased. Immortality would have been meaningless, trapped in a machine with a finite number of possible states. In a finite time, he would have exhausted the list of every possible thing he could be. Only the promise of eternal growth made sense of eternal life. Kate had timed their entrance into the replay perfectly. As they settled into the empty seats near the back of the hall, Paul Durham himself took the stage. He said, "Thank you for joining me. I've convened this meeting to discuss an important proposal concerning Planet Lambert." Peer groaned. "I could be making table legs, and you've dragged me along to Attack of the Killer Bees, Part 1093. Kate said, "You could always choose to be glad you're here. There's no need to be dissatisfied." Piers shut up, and Durham, frozen by the interruption, continued. "As most of you will know, the Lambertians have been making steady progress recently in the scientific treatment of their cosmology. A number of teams of theorists have proposed dust and gas cloud models for the formation of their planetary system, models which come very close to the truth. Although no such process has ever literally took place in the Autoverse, it was crudely simulated before the launch to help design a plausible ready-made system. The Lambertians are now zeroing in on the parameters of that simulation." He gestured at a giant screen behind him, and vision appeared, several thousand of the insect-like Lambertians swarming in the air above a lush blue-green meadow. Pier was disappointed. Scientific treatment of their cosmology sounded like the work of a technologically sophisticated culture, but there were no artifacts visible in the scene. No buildings, no machines, not even the simplest tools. He froze the image and expanded a portion of it. The creatures themselves looked exactly the same to him as they'd looked several 100,000 Lambertian years before, when they'd been singled out as the species most likely to give rise to civilization. Their segmented, chitinous bodies were still naked and unadorned. What had he expected? Insects in lab coats? No, but it was still hard to accept that the leaps they'd made in intelligence had left no mark on their appearance or their surroundings. Durham said, "They're communicating a version of the theory and actively demonstrating the underlying mathematics at the same time, like one group of researchers sending a computer model to another, but the Lambertians don't have artificial computers. If the dance looks valid, it's taken up by other groups, and if they sustain it long enough, they'll internalize the pattern. They'll be able to remember it without continuing to perform it." Pier whispered, "Come back to the workshop and dance cosmological models with me?" Kate ignored him. "The dominant theory employs accurate knowledge of Autoverse chemistry and physics, and includes a detailed breakdown of the composition of the primordial cloud. It goes no further. As yet, there's no hypothesis about the way in which that particular cloud might have come into existence, no explanation for the origin and relative abundances of the elements. And there can be no explanation, no sensible prior history. The Autoverse doesn't provide one. No Big Bang, general relativity doesn't apply. Their space-time is flat. Their universe isn't expanding. No elements formed in stars. There are no nuclear forces, no fusion. Stars burn by gravity alone. And their sun is the only star. So, these cosmologists are about to hit a brick wall, through no fault of their own. Dominique Repetto has suggested that now would be the ideal time for us to make contact with the Lambertians, to announce our presence, to explain their planet's origins, to begin a carefully moderated cultural exchange." A soft murmuring broke out among the crowd. Pier turned to Kate. "This is it? This is the news I couldn't miss?" She stared back at him pityingly. "They're talking about first contact with an alien race. Did you really want to sleepwalk right through that?" Pier laughed. "First contact? They've observed these insects in microscopic detail since the days they were single-celled algae. Everything about them is known already. Their biology, their language, their culture. It's all in the central library. These aliens have evolved on a microscope slide. There are no surprises in store." "Except how they respond to us." "Us? Nobody responds to us." Kate gave him a poisonous look. "How they respond to the Elysians." Pier thought it over. "I expect someone knows all about that, too. Someone must have modeled the reaction of Lambertian society to finding out that they're nothing but an experiment in artificial life." An Elysian presenting as a tall, thin young man took the stage. Durham introduced him as Dominique Repetto. Pier had given up trying to keep track of the proliferating dynasties long ago, but he thought the name was a recent addition. He certainly couldn't recall a Repetto being involved in Autoverse studies when he'd had a passion for the subject himself. Repetto addressed the meeting. It is my belief that the Lambertians now possess the conceptual framework they need to comprehend our existence and to make sense of our role in their cosmology. It's true that they lack artificial computers, but their whole language of ideas is based on representations of the world around them in the form of numerical models. These models were originally variations on a few genetically hardwired themes, maps of terrain showing food sources, algorithms for predicting predator behavior. But the modern Lambertians have evolved the skill of generating and testing whole new classes of models in a way that's as innate to them as language skills were to the earliest humans. A team of Lambertians can speak and judge a mathematical description of population dynamics in the mites they herd for food, as easily as pre launch humans could construct or comprehend a simple sentence. We mustn't judge them by anthropomorphic standards. Human technological landmarks simply aren't relevant. The Lambertians have deduced most of autoverse chemistry and physics by observation of their natural world, supplemented by a very small number of controlled experiments. They've generated concepts equivalent to temperature and pressure, energy and entropy, without fire, without metallurgy, or the wheel, let alone the steam engine. They've calculated the melting and boiling points of most of the elements, without ever purifying them. Their lack of technology only makes their intellectual achievements all the more astounding. It's as if the ancient Greeks had written about the boiling point of nitrogen, or the Egyptians had predicted the chemical properties of chlorine. Pierre smiled to himself cynically. The founders always loved to hear Earth rate a mention, and all the better if the references were to times long before they were born. Repetto paused. He grew perceptibly taller, and his youthful features became subtly more dignified, more mature. Most Elysians would see this as no more manipulative than a change in posture or tone of voice. He said solemnly, "Most of you will be aware of the resolution of the town meeting of January 5th, 3052, forbidding contact with the Lambertians until they'd constructed their own computers and performed simulations, experiments in artificial life, as sophisticated as the autoverse itself. That was judged to be the safest possible benchmark, but I believe it has turned out to be misconceived and completely inappropriate. The Lambertians are looking for answers to questions about their origins. We know there are no answers to be discovered inside the autoverse itself, but I believe the Lambertians are intellectually equipped to comprehend the larger truth. We have a responsibility to make that truth known to them. I propose that this meeting overturns the resolution of 3052 and authorizes a team of autoverse scholars to enter planet Lambert and, in a culturally sensitive manner, inform the Lambertians of their history and context." The buzz of discussion grew louder. Pierre felt a vestigial twinge of interest, in spite of himself. In a universe without death or scarcity, politics took strange forms. Any one of the founders who disagreed with the way Planet Lambert was managed would be perfectly free to copy the whole autoverse into their own territory and to do as they wished with their own private version. In inverse proportion to the ease of such a move, any faction would have a rare chance here to demonstrate their influence and increase their prestige by persuading the meeting to retain the ban on contact with the Lambertians, without provoking their opponents into cloning the autoverse and pushing ahead regardless. Many of the first generation still chose to value these things for their own sake. Elaine Sanderson rose to her feet, resplendent in a light blue suit and body which together proclaimed 1972 to 2045 AD, and proud of it, even if she only wore them on official occasions. Pierre let himself time trip for a second. In his late teens, David Hawthorne had seen the flesh and blood Sanderson on television, being sworn in as Attorney General of the United States of America, a nation whose constituent particles at the time of that oath might well overlap with some portion of Elysium at this very instant. Sanderson said, Thank you, Mr. Ripetta, for giving us your perspective on this important matter. It's unfortunate that so few of us take the time to keep ourselves up to date with the progress of the Lambertians. Although they have come all the way from single-celled life forms to their present highly sophisticated state without our explicit intervention, ultimately they are in our care at every moment, and we all have a duty to treat that responsibility with the utmost seriousness. I can still recall some of the earliest plans we made for dealing with the Autoverse: to hide the details of life on planet Lambert from ourselves, deliberately, to watch and wait, as if from afar, until the inhabitants sent probes into their system's other worlds, to arrive as explorers in spaceships, struggling to learn the language and customs of these aliens, perhaps going so far as to extend the Autoverse to include an invisibly distant star, with a homeworld from which we might travel. Slavish imitations of the hypothetical interstellar missions we'd left behind. Bizarre charades. Mercifully, we abandoned those childish ideas long ago. There will be no sham mission of discovery, and no lying to the Lambertians, or to ourselves. There is only one quality of those early, laughable schemes which should still be kept in mind, though. We always intended to meet with the Lambertians as equals. Visitors from a distant world who would stretch their vision of the universe, but not subvert it, not swallow it whole. We would approach them as siblings, arguing our viewpoint, not gods revealing the divine truth. I ask the meeting to consider whether these two equally laudable aims of honesty and humility could not be reconciled. If the Lambertians are on the verge of a crisis in understanding their origins, what patronizing instinct compels us to rush in and provide them with an instant solution? Mr. Ripetta tells us how they have already inferred the properties of the chemical elements, elements which remain mysterious and invisible, manifesting themselves only in the elaborate phenomena of the natural world. Clearly, the Lambertians have a gift for uncovering hidden patterns, hidden explanations. How many more centuries can it be, then, before they guess the truth about their own cosmology? I propose that we delay contact until the hypothesis of our existence has arisen naturally amongst the Lambertians, and has been thoroughly explored; until they have decided for themselves exactly what we might mean to them; until they have debated, as we are debating right now, how best they might deal with us. If aliens had visited Earth the moment humans first looked up at the sky and suffered some crisis of understanding, they would have been hailed as gods. If they'd arrived in the early 21st century, when humans had been predicting their existence and pondering the logistics of contact for decades, they would have been accepted as equals, more experienced, more skilled, more knowledgeable, but ultimately nothing but an expected part of a well behaved, well understood universe. I believe that we should wait for the equivalent moment in Lambertian history, when the Lambertians are impatient for proof of our existence, when our continued absence becomes far harder for them to explain than our arrival would be. Once they begin to suspect that we're eavesdropping on every conversation they hold about us, it would be dishonest to remain concealed. Until then, we owe them the opportunity to find as many answers as they can without us. Sanderson resumed her seat. Portions of the audience applauded demurely. Peer lazily mapped the response and correlated it with appearance. She seemed to have been a big hit with the third generation mainstream, but they had a reputation for gleefully faking everything. Kate said, "Don't you wish you could join the discussion?" Half sarcasm, half self pity. Peer said cheerfully, "No, but if you have strong views on the matter yourself, I suggest you copy the whole Autoverse and make contact with the Lambertians personally, or leave them in unspoiled ignorance, whichever you prefer." "You know I don't have room to do that." "And you know that makes no difference. There's a copy of the original Biosphere seed, the entire compressed description, in the Central Library. You could copy that and freeze yourself until you finally have the room to unfold it. The whole thing's deterministic. Every Lambertian would flutter its little wings for you in exactly the same way as it did for the Elysians, right up to the moment of contact."
And you honestly believe that the city will grow that large?
That after 1 billion years of standard time, they won't have trashed it and built something new?
I don't know, but there's always the alternative. You could launch a whole new TVC universe and make all the room you need. I'll come along if you want me to.
He meant it. He'd follow her anywhere. She only had to say the word. She looked away, but she looked away. He ached to grant her happiness, but the choice was hers. If she wanted to believe that she was standing outside in the snow, or rather bricked into the walls, watching the Elysians feast on reality, there was nothing he could do to change that. 307 speakers followed. 162 backed Repetto, 140 backed Sanderson, supported Sanderson. 5 waffled on with no apparent agenda, a remarkably low proportion. Peer daydreamed about the sound of sandpaper on wood. When the vote finally came, one per original attendee, no last-minute clonings accepted, Sanderson won by a 10% margin. She took the stage and made a short speech thanking the voters for their decision. Peer suspected that many of the Elysians had quietly slipped out of their bodies and gone elsewhere by now. Dominic Repetto said a few words too, clearly disappointed but gracious in defeat. It was Paul Durham, presumably his mentor and sponsor, who showed the slightly vacuous expression of a model of a body with its facial muscles crudely decoupled from its model of a brain. Durham, with his strange history of brief episodes as a copy in different permutations, seemed to have never really caught up with the pre-launch state-of-the-art, let alone the Elysian cutting edge. When he had something to hide, it was obvious. He was taking the decision badly. Kate said coldly, "That's it. You've fulfilled your civic duty. You can go now." Peer made his eyes big and brown. "Come back to the workshop with me. We can make love in the wood dust. Or just sit around and talk. Be happy, for no reason. It wouldn't be so bad." Kate shook her head and faded away. Peer felt a pang of disappointment, but not for long. There'd be other times. Chapter 25. Thomas crouched in the bathroom window frame, halfway out of Anna's flat. He knew that the edges of the brickwork would be sharper than razors this time. He made his way across to the neighbor's window, repeating the familiar movements precisely, though his hands and forearms wept blood. Insects crawled from the wounds and swarmed along his arms, over his face, into his mouth. He gagged and retched, but he didn't falter. Down the drain pipe. From the alley below he returned to the flat. Anna was by his side on the stairs. They danced again, argued again, struggled again. "Think fast, think fast." He knelt over her, one knee to either side, took her face in his hands, then closed his eyes. He brought her head forward, then slammed it back against the wall. 5 times. Then he held his fingers near her nostrils, without opening his eyes. He felt no exhalation. Thomas was in his Frankfurt apartment, a month after the murder, dreaming. Anna stood by the bed. He reached out from beneath the blankets into the darkness, eyes closed. She took his hand in hers. With her other hand she stroked the scar on his forearm tenderly, and then she pushed one finger easily through his brittle skin and liquefying flesh. He thrashed against the sheets, but she wouldn't let go. She dug with her fingers until she was gripping naked bone. When she snapped the ulna and radius, he convulsed with pain and ejaculated suddenly, everything his corrupt body contained departing in a single stream. Dark, clotted blood, maggots, pus, excrement. Thomas was in his suburban mansion, sitting naked on the floor at the end of a hallway, startled. He shifted his right hand and realized that he was clutching a small vegetable knife. And he remembered why. There were 7 faint pink scars on his abdomen, 7 digits, still legible, right way up as he gazed down at them. 1053901. He set to work recarving the first 6. He didn't trust the clocks. The clocks lied. And although every incision he made in his skin healed perfectly, given time, for a long time it seemed he had managed to repair the numbers before they faded. He didn't know what they measured, except their own steady ascent. Sorry. He didn't know what they measured, except their own steady ascent, but they seemed like a touchstone of something approaching sanity. He recut the final digit as a 2, then licked his fingers and wiped the blood away. At first it seeped back, but after 5 or 6 repetitions, the fresh wound stood clean and red against his pale skin. He pronounced the number several times. 1,053,902. Thomas climbed to his feet and walked down the hall. His body knew only the time he carved upon it. He never felt tired, or hungry, or even unclean. He could sleep or not sleep, eat or not eat, wash or not wash. It made no perceptible difference. His hair and fingernails never grew. His face never aged. He stopped outside the library. He believed he'd methodically torn all the books to shreds several times, but on each occasion the debris had been cleared away and the books replaced, in his absence. He walked into the room. He glanced at the terminal in the corner, the object of his deepest loathing. He'd never been able to damage it, smash, chip, bend, or even scratch any part of its visible form. Indestructible or not, it had never functioned. He wandered from shelf to shelf, but he'd read every book a dozen or more times. They'd all become meaningless. The library was well stocked, and he'd studied the sacred texts of every faith. Those few which, by some stretch of poetic license, might have been said to describe his condition, offered no prospect for changing it. In the distant past he'd undergone 100 feverish conversions. He'd ranted to every deity which humanity had ever postulated. If he'd stumbled on the one which existed, the one responsible for his damnation, his pleas had been to no avail. The one thing he'd never expected after death was uncertainty. It had worried him deeply at first, being cast into hell without so much as a glimpse of heaven to taunt him, and a smug "I told you so" from the faithful on their way up, let alone a formal trial before the God of his childhood, in which every doctrinal assertion he'd ever doubted was proclaimed as absolute truth, and every theological debate was resolved once and for all. But he'd since decided that if his condition was eternal and irreversible, it hardly mattered what the God who'd made it was so named. Thomas sat cross-legged on the floor of the library and tried to empty his mind. Think fast, think fast. Anna lay before him, bleeding and unconscious. Time slowed down. The moment he was approaching seemed impossible to face, impossible to traverse yet again, but he inched toward it, and he knew that he had no power to turn away. He'd come to understand that all the visions of his own decay and mutilation were nothing but elaborate gestures of self-loathing. When his flesh was torn from his body, it was a distraction, almost a relief. His suffering did not illuminate his crime. It drowned his thoughts in an anesthetic haze. It was a fantasy of power, a fantasy of retribution. But here there was no balm of self-righteous pain, no pretense that his baroque tortures were working some alchemy of justice. He knelt over Anna, and could not weep, could not flinch, could not blind himself to the measure of what he'd done. He might have called an ambulance. He might have saved her life. It would have taken so little strength, so little courage, so little love, that he could not imagine how a human being could have failed to possess enough of each and still walk the earth. But he had. He had. So he brought her head forward and slammed it against the wall. So he's living it up. He's enjoying eternity, for sure. Chapter 26. After a week as Durham's guest, Maria went looking for a place of her own. Her anger had faded, the numbness of shock had faded, the fifth or sixth wave of disbelief had finally lifted. But she still felt almost paralyzed by the strangeness of the truths she'd been forced to accept. Her exile from the universe of flesh and blood humanity, the impossible existence of Elysium, intelligent life in the autoverse. She couldn't begin to make sense of any of these things until she had a fixed point to stand on. She had refused to pay any she had refused to pack any luggage to accompany her scan file into the next life. It would have felt like she was humoring Durham if she'd made the slightest concession to the needs of a copy who she believed would never run. Who she'd believed would never run. No environments, no furniture, no clothes, no photographs. Oh, sorry. No environments, no furniture, no clothes, no photographs, no diaries, no scanned memorabilia. No VR duplicate of her old narrow terrace to make her feel at home. She might have set about reconstructing it from memory, detail by detail, or let architectural software pluck a perfect imitation straight out of her brain, but she didn't feel strong enough to deal with the emotional contradictions. The tug of the old world, the taint of self-deception. Instead, she decided to choose one of the predefined apartments in the city itself. Durham assured her that nobody would begrudge her the use of public resources. Of course, you could copy the city into your own territory and run a private version at your own expense, defeating the whole point. This is the one environment in all of Elysium which comes close to being a place in the old sense. Anyone can walk the streets, anyone can live here, but no one can rearrange the skyline on a whim. It would require a far more impassioned debate to alter the colors of the street signs here than it used to take for the average local council to rezone an entire neighborhood. So Permutation City offered her its disingenuous, municipally sanctioned, quasi-objective presence for free, while her model of a body ran on processors in her own territory, and the two systems, by exchanging data, contrived her experience of walking the streets, entering the sleek metallic buildings, and exploring the empty apartments which might have smelled of paint but didn't. She felt nervous on her own, so Durham came with her, solicitous and apologetic as ever. His regret seemed sincere on one level. He wasn't indifferent to the pain he'd caused her, but beneath that there didn't seem to be much doubt. He clearly expected to be wholly forgiven for waking her, sooner or later. She asked him, "How does it feel, being 7,000 years old?" "That depends." "On what?" "On how I want it to feel." "On how I want it to feel." There we go. She found a place in the northeast quadrant, halfway between the central tower and the city's rim. From the bedroom she could see the mountains in the east, the glistening waterfall, a distant patch of forest. There were better views available, but this one seemed right. Anything more spectacular would have made her feel self-conscious. Durham showed her how to claim residency, a brief dialogue with the apartment software. He said, "You're the only Elysian in this tower, so you can program all your neighbors any way you like." "What if I do nothing?" "Default behavior. They'll stay out of your way." "And what about the other Elysians? Am I such a novelty that people will come looking for me?" Durham thought it over. "Your awakening is public knowledge, but most people here are fairly patient. I doubt that anyone would be so rude as to buttonhole you in the street. Your phone number will remain unlisted until you choose otherwise, and the apartment itself is under your control, now, as secure as any private environment. The software has been rigorously validated. Breaking and entering is mathematically impossible." He left her to settle in. She paced the rooms, trying to inhabit them, to claim them as her own. She forced herself to walk the nearby streets, trying to feel at ease. The Art Deco apartments, the Fritz Lang towers, the streets full of crowd-scene extras, all unnerved her. But on reflection, she realized that she couldn't have gone anywhere else. When she tried to imagine her territory, her private slice of Elysium, it seemed as daunting and unmanageable as if she'd inherited 1/24th of the old universe of galaxies and vacuum. That that the new one was generally invisible and built from a lattice of self-reproducing computers, built in turn from cellular automaton cells, which were nothing more than sequences of numbers, however easy it might be to color code them and arrange them into neat grids, only made the thought of being lost in its vastness infinitely stranger. It was bad enough that her true body was a pattern of computation resonating in a tiny portion of an otherwise silent crystalline pyramid which stretched into the distance for the TVC equivalent of thousands of light years. The thought of immersing her senses in a fake world which was really another corner of the same structure, withdrawing entirely into the darkness of that giant airless crypt and surrendering to private hallucinations, made her sick with panic. If the city was equally unreal, at least it was one hallucination which other Elysians shared, and, anchored by that consensus, she found the courage to examine the invisible world beneath from a safe, if hallucinatory, distance. She sat in the apartment and studied maps of Elysium. On the largest scale, most of the cube was portrayed as featureless. The other 17 founders' pyramids were private, and her own was all but unused. Public territory could be colored according to the software it ran, processes identified, data flows traced, but even then most of it was monochrome. 5 of the 6 public pyramids were devoted to the Autoverse, running the same simple program on processor after processor, implementing the Autoverse's own cellular automaton rules, utterly different from the TVC's. A faint metallic grid was superimposed on this region, like a mesh of fine wires immersed in an unknown substance to gauge its properties. This was the software which spied on planet Lambert, an entirely separate program from the Autoverse itself, not subject to any of its laws. Maria had written the original version herself, although she'd never had a chance to test it on a planetary scale. Generations of Elysian Autoverse scholars had extended and refined it, and now it peeked through a quadrillion non-existent cracks in space, collating, interpreting, and summarizing everything it saw. The results flowed to the hub of Elysium, into the central library, along a channel rendered luminous as white-hot silver by the density of its data flow. The hub itself was a dazzling polyhedron, a cluster of databases ringed by the communication structures which handled the torrent of information flowing to and from the pyramids. Every transaction between Elysians of different clans flowed through here, from phone calls to handshakes, from sex to whatever elaborate post-human intimacies they'd invented in the past 7,000 years. The map gave nothing away, though. Even with the highest magnification and the slowest replay, streaming packets of data registered as nothing more than featureless points of light, their contents safely anonymous. The second brightest data flow linked the hub to the city, revealed as a delicate labyrinth of algorithms clinging to one face of the sixth public pyramid. With the Autoverse software across the border rendered midnight blue, the city looked like a cluttered, neon-lit fairground on the edge of a vast desert, at the end of a shimmering highway. Maria zoomed in and watched the packets of data responsible for the map itself come streaming out from the hub. There was no point-for-point correspondence between this view and the city of the senses. The crowds of fake pedestrians, spread across the visible metropolis, could all be found here, as a tight assembly of tiny flashing blocks in pastel shades, with titles like Flocking Behavior and Miscellaneous Tropisms. The locations and other attributes of specific individuals were encoded in data structures too small to be seen without relentless magnification. Maria's own apartment was equally microscopic, but it was the product of widely scattered components, as far apart as surface optics, air dynamics, thermal radiation, and carpet texture. She might have viewed her own body as a similar diagram of functional modules, but she decided to let that wait, one vivisection at a time. She began exploring the information resources of Elysium, the data networks which portrayed themselves as such, leaving the apartment to walk alone through the city twice a day, familiarizing herself with the two spaces analogous to those she'd known in the past. She skimmed through the libraries, not quite at random, flicking through Homer and Joyce, staring at the Rembrandts and Picassos and Moores, playing snatches of Chopin and Liszt, viewing scenes from Bergman and Buñuel, Hefting the weight of the kernel of human civilization, the Elysian, hefting the weight of the kernel of civilization. I'm getting dry. Hefting the weight. I don't even see the sentence right now. There it is. Hefting the weight of the kernel of human civilization that the Elysians had brought with them. It felt light. Dubliners was as fantastic now as the Iliad. Guernica had never really happened. Or if it had, the Elysian view was beyond the powers of any artist to portray. The Seventh Seal was a mad, pointless fairy tale. The discreet charm of the bourgeoisie was all that remained. Altering herself in any way was too hard a decision to make, so, faithful by default to human physiology, she ate and shat and slept. There were 1,000 ways to conjure food into existence, from gourmet meals in the culinary database literally emerging from the screen of her terminal, to the time-saving option of push-button satiety and a pleasant aftertaste. But old rituals clamored to be reenacted, so she went out and bought raw ingredients from puppet shopkeepers in aromatic delicatessens and cooked her own meals, often badly, and grew curiously tired watching the imperfect chemistry at work, as if she was performing the difficult simulation, subconsciously, herself. For 3 nights she dreamed that she was back in the old world, having unremarkable conversations with her parents, school friends, fellow Autoverse junkies, old lovers. Whatever the scene, the air was charged, glowing with self-conscious authenticity. She woke from these dreams crippled with loss, clawing at the retreating certainties, believing, for 10 seconds or 5, that Durham had drugged her, hypnotized her, brainwashed her into dreaming of Elysium. And each time she thought she slept here, she awoke into the earthly life she'd never stopped living. Then the fog cleared from her brain, and she knew that it wasn't true. She dreamed of the city for the first time. She was out on 15th Avenue when the puppets started pleading with her to be treated as fully sentient. "We pass the Turing test, don't we? Is a stranger in a crowd less than human just because you can't witness her in her life?" They tugged at her clothes like beggars. She told them not to be absurd. She said, "How can you complain? Don't you understand? We've abolished injustice." A man in a crisp black suit eyed her sharply and muttered, "You'll always have the poor." But he was wrong. And she dreamed of Elysium itself. She weaved her way through the TVC grid in gaps between the processors, transformed into a simple self-sustaining pattern of cells, like the oldest, most primitive forms of artificial life, disturbing nothing but observing everything, in all 6 dimensions, no less. She woke when she realized how absurd that was. Oh, there's a colon there. She woke when she realized how absurd that was. The TVC universe wasn't flooded with some analog of light spreading information about every cell far and wide. To be embedded in the grid meant being all but blind to its contents. Reaching out and painstakingly probing what lay ahead, sometimes destructively, was the only way to discover anything. In the late afternoons, in the golden light which flooded in through the bedroom window after 1,000 chance, calculated reflections between the towers, she usually wept. It felt inadequate, desultory, pathetic, immoral. She didn't want to mourn the human race, but she didn't know how to make sense of its absence. She refused to imagine a world long dead, as if her Elysian millennia of sleep had propelled her into Earth's uncertain future. So she struggled to bind herself to the time she remembered, to follow the life of her doppelganger in her mind. She pictured a reconciliation with Aidan. It wasn't impossible. She pictured him very much alive, as tender and selfish and stubborn as ever. She fantasized the most mundane, the most unexceptional moments between them, ruthlessly weeding out anything that seemed too optimistic, too much like wish fulfillment. She wasn't interested in she wasn't interested in inventing a perfect life for the other Maria. She only wanted to guess the unknowable truth. But she had to keep believing that she'd saved Francesca. Anything less would have been unbearable. She tried to think of herself as an emigrant, an ocean crosser in the days before aircraft, before telegraphs. People had left everything behind and survived, prospered, flourished. Their lives hadn't been destroyed. They'd embraced the unknown and been enriched, transformed. The unknown? She was living in an artifact, a mathematical object she'd helped Durham construct for his billionaires. Elysium was a universe made to order. It contained no hidden wonders, no lost tribes. But it did contain the Autoverse. The longer she thought about it, the more it seemed that Planet Lambert was the key to her sanity. Even after 3 billion years of evolution, it was the one thing in Elysium which connected with her past life, leading right back to the night she'd witnessed A. Lamberti digesting mutos. The thread was unbroken. The seed organism, A. hydrophila, had come from that very strain. If the Autoverse, then, had been the ultimate indulgence, a rarefied intellectual game in a world beset with problems, the situation now was completely inverted. The Autoverse was home to hundreds of millions of life forms, a flourishing civilization, a culture on the verge of a scientific revolution. In a universe subject to whim, convenience, and fantasy, it seemed like the only solid ground left. And although she suffered no delusions of having personally created the Lambertians, sketching their planet's early history and cobbling together an ancestor for them by adapting someone else's translation of a terrestrial bacterium, hardly qualified her to take credit for their multiplexed nervous systems and their open-air digestive tracts, let alone their self-awareness, she couldn't simply wash her hands of their fate. She'd never believed that Planet Lambert could be brought into existence, but she had helped to make it happen nonetheless. Part of her still wanted to do nothing but rage against her awakening and mourn her loss. Embracing the Autoverse seemed like an insult to the memory of Earth, and a sign that she'd accepted the way Durham had treated her. But it began to seem perverse to the point of insanity to turn her back on the one thing which might give her new life some meaning, just to spite Durham, just to make a lie of his reasons for waking her. There were other ways of making it clear she hadn't forgiven him. The apartment, at first inconceivably large, almost uninhabitable, slowly lost its strangeness. On the 10th morning she finally woke expecting the sight of the bedroom exactly as she found it, if not at peace with her situation, at least unsurprised to be exactly where she was. She phoned Durham and said, "I want to join the expedition." The contact group occupied one story of a tower in the southeast quadrant. Maria, uninterested in teleporting, made the journey on foot, crossing from building to building by walkway, ignoring the puppets and admiring the view. It was faster than traveling at street level, and she was gradually conquering her fear of heights. Bridges here did not collapse from unanticipated vibrations. Perspex tubes did not hurtle to the ground, spilling corpses onto the pavement. It made no difference whether or not Malcolm Carter had known the first thing about structural engineering. The city was hardly going to bother laboriously modeling stresses and loads just to discover whether or not parts of itself should fail for the sake of realism. Everything was perfectly safe by decree. Durham was waiting for her in the foyer. Inside, he introduced her to Dominic Repetto and Alyssa Zemansky, the project's other leaders. Maria hadn't known what to expect from her first contact with later generation Elysians, but they presented as neatly dressed humans, male and female, both in their late 30s, wearing that's in quotes, wearing clothes which would not have looked wildly out of place in any office in 21st century Sydney. Out of deference to her? She hoped not, unless the accepted thing to do, in their subculture, was to show a different form to everyone, expressly designed to put them at ease. Repetto, in fact, was so strikingly handsome that she almost recoiled at the thought that he, or his parent, had deliberately chosen such a face. But what did codes of vanity from the age of cosmetic surgery and gene splicing mean now? Zemansky was stunning too, with dark flecked violet eyes and spiked blonde hair. Durham appeared, to her at least, almost unchanged from the man she'd met in 2050. Maria began to wonder how she looked to the young Elysians. Like something recently disinterred, probably. Repetto shook her hand over and over. "It's a great, great honor to meet you. I can't tell you how much you've inspired us all." His face shone. He seemed to be sincere. Maria felt her cheeks flush, and tried to imagine herself in some analogous situation, shaking hands with who? Max Lambert? John Van Neumann? Alan Turing? Charles Babbage? Ada Lovelace? She knew she'd done nothing compared to any of those pioneers, but she'd had 7,000 years for her reputation to be embellished, and 3 billion for her work to bear fruit. The floor was divided into open plan offices, but nobody else seemed to be about. Durham saw her peering around the partitions and said cryptically, "There are the workers, but they come and go." Zemansky led the way into a small conference room. She said to Maria, "We can move to a VR representation of Planet Lambert if you like, but I should warn you that it can be disorienting, being visually immersed but intangible, walking through vegetation and so on. And moving at the kinds of speeds necessary to keep track of the Lambertians can induce motion sickness. Of course, there are neural changes which counteract both those problems." Maria wasn't ready to start tampering with her brain, or to step onto the surface of an alien planet. She said, "Viewing screens sound easier. I'd be happier with that. Do you mind?" Zemansky looked relieved. Repetto stood at the end of the table and addressed the three of them, although Maria knew this was all for her benefit. "So much has been happening on Lambert lately that we've slowed it right down compared to standard time so we can keep up with the developments." An elliptical map of the planet's surface appeared on the wall behind him. "Most recently, dozens of independent teams of chemists have begun looking for a simpler, more unified model underlying the current atomic theory." Markers appeared, scattered across the map. "It's been 300 years since the Standard Model, 32 atoms with a regular pattern of masses, valencies, and mutual affinities, became widely accepted. The Lambertian equivalent of Mendeleyev's periodic table." He flashed a smile at Maria, as if she might have been a contemporary of Mendeleev, or perhaps because he was proud of his arcane knowledge of the history of a science which was no longer true. "At the time, atoms were accepted as fundamental entities, structureless, indivisible, requiring no further explanation. Over the last 20 years, that view has finally begun to break down." Maria was already confused. From the hurried reading she'd done in the past few days, she knew that the Lambertians only modified an established theory when a new phenomenon was discovered which the theory failed to explain. Repetto must have noticed her expression, because he paused expectantly. She said, "Autoverse atoms are indivisible. There are no components you can separate out, no smaller stable entities. Smash them together at any energy you like, and all they'll do is bounce. And the Lambertians are in no position to smash them together at any energy at all. So, surely there's nothing in their experience that the current theory can't account for perfectly." "Nothing in their immediate environment, certainly. But the problem is cosmology. They've been refining the models of the history of their star system, and now they're looking for an explanation for the composition of the primordial cloud." "They accepted the 32 atoms and the properties as given, but they can't bring themselves to do the same with the arbitrary amounts of each one in the cloud?" "That's right. It's difficult to translate the motivation exactly, but they have a very precise aesthetic which dictates what they'll accept as a theory, and it's almost physically impossible for them to contradict it. If they try to dance a theory which fails to resonate with the neural system which assesses its simplicity, the dance falls apart." He thought for a second, then pointed to the screen behind him. A swarm of Lambertians appeared. "Here's an example, going back a while. This is a team of astronomers, all fully aware of the motions of the planets in the sky relative to the sun, testing out a theory which attempts to explain those observations by assuming that planet Lambert is fixed and everything else orbits around it." Maria watched the creatures intently. She would have been hard pressed to identify the rhythms in their elaborate weaving motions, but when the swarm began to drift apart, the collapse of order was obvious. Now here's the heliocentric version from a few years later. The dance, again, was too complex to analyze, although it did seem to be more harmonious, and after a while, almost hypnotic. The black specks shifting back and forth against the white sky left trails on her retinas. Below, the ubiquitous grassland seemed an odd setting for astronomical theorizing. The Lambertians apparently accepted their condition, in which herding mites represented the greatest control they exerted over nature, as if it constituted as much of a utopia as the Elysians' total freedom. They still faced predators. Many still died young from disease. Food was always plentiful, though. They'd modeled their own population cycles and learned to damp the oscillations at a very early stage. And, nature lovers or not, there'd be no ideological struggles over birth control. Once the population model had spread, the same remedies had been adopted by communities right across the planet. Lambertian cultural diversity was limited. Far more behavior was genetically determined than was the case in humans, the young being born self-sufficient with far less neural plasticity than a human infant, and there was relatively little variation in the relevant genes. The heliocentric theory was acceptable. The dance remained coherent. Repetto replayed the scene, with a translation in a small window, showing the positions of the planets represented at each moment. Maria still couldn't decipher the correspondence. The Lambertians certainly weren't flying around in simple mimicry of the hypothetical orbits, but the synchronized rhythms of planets and insect astronomers seemed to mesh somewhere in her visual cortex, firing some pattern detector which didn't know quite what to make of the strange resonance. She said, "So Ptolemy was simply bad grammar, obvious nonsense. Double plus ungood. And they reached Copernicus a few years later? That's impressive. How long did they take to get to Kepler? To Newton?" Zemansky said smoothly, That was Newton. The theory of gravity and the laws of motion were all part of the model they were dancing. The Lambertians could never have expressed the shapes of the orbits without including a reason for them." Maria felt the hairs rise on the back of her neck. If that was Newton, what came before? Nothing. That was the first successful astronomical model, the culmination of about a decade of trial and error by teams all over the planet. But they must have had something. Primitive myths, stacks of turtles, sun gods in chariots. Zemansky laughed. No turtles or chariots, obviously. But no naive cosmologies. Their earliest language grew out of the things they could easily observe and model: ecological relationships, population dynamics. When cosmology was beyond their grasp, they didn't even try to tackle it. It was a non-subject. No creation myths? No. To the Lambertians, believing any kind of myth, any kind of vague, untestable pseudo-explanation, would have been like suffering hallucinations, seeing mirages, hearing voices. It would have rendered them completely dysfunctional. Maria cleared her throat. Then I wonder how they'll react to us. Durham said, "Right now, creators are a non-subject. The Lambertians have no need of that hypothesis. They understand evolution, mutation, natural selection. They've even postulated some kind of macromolecular gene. But the origin of life remains an open question, too difficult to tackle, and it would probably be centuries before they realize that their ultimate ancestor was seeded by hand. If, in fact, there's any evidence to show that, any logical reason why A. hydrophila couldn't have arisen in some imaginary prebiotic history. But it won't come to that. After a few more decades banging their heads against the problem of the primordial cloud, I think they'll guess what's going on. An idea whose time has come can sweep across the planet in a matter of months, however exotic it might be. These creatures are not traditionalists. And once the theory that their world was made arises in the proper scientific context, it's not going to drive them mad. All Alyssa was saying was that the sort of primitive superstitions which early humans believed in wouldn't have made sense to the early Lambertians. Maria said, So we'll wait until creators are no longer a non-subject before we barge in and announce that that's exactly what we are? Durham replied, Absolutely. We have permission to make contact once the Lambertians have independently postulated our existence, and no sooner. He laughed and added, with evident satisfaction, which was achieved by asking for much more. Maria still felt uneasy, but she didn't want to hold up proceedings while she grappled with the subtleties of Lambertian culture. She said, All right, cosmology is the trigger, but they are looking for a deeper explanation for their chemistry. Are they having any luck? Repetto brought back the map of planet Lambert. The markers showing the locations of the teams of theorists were replaced by small bar charts in the same positions. These are the dance times sustained for various subatomic models which have been explored over the past 5 years. A few theories are showing some promise, improving slightly with each refinement. Other groups are getting fairly random results. Nobody's come up with anything they'd be capable of communicating over any distance. These dances are too short-lived to be remembered by teams of messengers. Maria felt her skin crawl again. False messages die en route. There was something chilling about all this efficiency, this ruthless pursuit of the truth. Or maybe it was just a matter of injured pride, treating some of humanity's most hard-won intellectual achievements as virtually self-evident wasn't the most endearing trait an alien species could possess. She said, So no team is on the verge of discovering the truth? Repetto shook his head. Not yet, but the Autoverse rules are the simplest explanation for the 32 atoms, by almost any criterion. Simplest to us. There's nothing in the Lambertians' environment to make them think in terms of cellular automata. Zemansky said, There was nothing in their environment to make them think in terms of atoms. Well, no, but the ancient Greeks thought of atoms, but they didn't come up with quantum mechanics. Maria couldn't imagine a pre-industrial human inventing the cellular automaton, even as a mathematical abstraction, let alone going on to hypothesize that the universe itself might be one. Clockwork cosmologies had come after physical clocks. Computer cosmologies had come after physical computers. Human history, though, clearly wasn't much of a guide to Lambertian science. They already had their Newtonian, clockwork, planetary model. They didn't need artifacts that pointed the way. She said, This aesthetic which governs the acceptability of theories, have you been able to map the neural structures involved? Can you reproduce the criteria? Repetto said, Yes, and I think I know what you're going to ask next. You've devised your own versions of possible Lambertian cellular automaton theories? And you've tested them against the Lambertian aesthetic? He inclined his head modestly. Yes, we don't model whole brains, of course. That would be grossly unethical. But we can run simulations of trial dances with non-conscious Lambertian neural models. Modeling Lambertians, modeling the Autoverse. So how did it go? Repetto was hesitant. The results so far are inconclusive. None of the theories I've constructed have worked, but it's a difficult hypothesis. It's a difficult business. It's hard to know whether or not I'm really stating the hypothesis in the way the Lambertians would, or whether I've really captured all the subtleties of the relevant behavior in a non-conscious model. But it doesn't look promising? It's inconclusive. Maria thought it over. The Autoverse rules alone wouldn't explain the abundances of the elements, which is the main problem the Lambertians are trying to solve. So what happens if they miss the whole idea of a cellular automaton and come up with a completely different theory, something utterly misguided, which fits all the data nonetheless? I know they've grasped everything else about their world far more smoothly than humans ever did, but that doesn't make them perfect. And if they have no tradition of giving up on difficult questions by invoking the hand of a creator, they might cobble together something which explains both the primordial cloud and the chemical properties of the elements, without coming anywhere near the truth. That's not impossible, is it? There was a there was an awkward silence. Maria wondered if she'd committed some terrible faux pas by suggesting that the criteria for contact might never be met. But she could hardly be telling these people anything they hadn't already considered. Then Durham said simply, No, it's not impossible, so you'll just have to wait and see where the Lambertians' own logic takes them.
And that is where we will call it for this week. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. This has been a particularly dense installment of the book. This is very close to peak Greg Egan in terms of, hey, we're just throwing lots of ideas at you very quickly. Um, there's a whole lot going on here. So hopefully people enjoyed, even if it's Greg Egan in general. I acknowledge as being a fairly niche interest. Um, he's a toughie, but I adore him nonetheless because he makes my brain itch in a good way. So anyway, with that, I'm going to leave you all. Uh, as always, I stream these live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, starting at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time, U.S. East Coast time, or UTC -5, whatever your preference, or whatever is easier for you to translate that. Um, Otherwise, you can just listen to them after the fact. No skin off my back, is it? No, sir. Anyway, this Friday we will be reading through more of The Dark Forest by Shijin Liu. Next Monday might be dicey. If I'm not here, I'm sorry. I hope to be, but we'll find out. Um, with that said, stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. I'll see you all later.